The dark side, everything you experience, your choices, your emotions, your relationships, is shaped by forces you never consciously agreed to. Social pressure, instinct, fear, ego, algorithms, unspoken rules, hidden power dynamics. Most people drift through life reacting to forces they never examine. But once you start to notice them, the world stops feeling random. You begin to see patterns, motives, predictable behaviors, and eventually you learn to navigate life with intention instead of instinct. When morality breaks, the fragile nature of human goodness, every society likes to imagine itself built on principles: fairness, empathy, justice, decency. Parents teach children to be kind, schools encourage cooperation, religions preach compassion, and nations promote ideals of unity. But beneath these cultural narratives lies a more unsettling truth. Morality is fragile. It bends under pressure, collapses under fear, it mutates under ego. And when the right circumstances appear, people who once believed themselves incapable of cruelty transform with alarming speed. This section begins with that uncomfortable reality. Human morality is not a stable structure. It is a psychological luxury that survives only when life is predictable and safe. The moment uncertainty grows, political tension rises, or personal fears are triggered, morality becomes flexible. People begin to justify what they once condemned. They abandon ideals to protect themselves. They choose conformity over courage. And they convince themselves they are still good, even as their actions shift into darker territory. Machiavelli witnessed this firsthand. He watched citizens who claimed to love justice turn silent when injustice benefited them. He observed leaders who spoke endlessly about virtue but dropped those virtues the moment power was threatened. He saw how quickly loyalty decayed when fear entered the room. To Machiavelli, morality was not a reliable compass. It was a performance, sustained only when circumstances made virtue easy. Modern psychology confirms what Machiavelli saw centuries ago. The Milgram obedience experiments revealed how ordinary people, under pressure from authority, were willing to harm others simply because they were told to. The Stanford prison experiment showed how social roles quickly override personal ethics. Groupthink demonstrated that individuals suppress their values when belonging feels more important than truth. History shows that entire populations, given the right fear or propaganda, can shift from peaceful neighbors to vicious rivals overnight. This fragility is not evidence of human evil. It is evidence of human adaptability. Humans do not act according to moral principles. They act according to emotional survival. When fear rises, logic shrinks. When identity is threatened, compassion fades. When scarcity appears, generosity collapses. What we call morality is often nothing more than a temporary agreement that holds as long as no one feels endangered. This section then moves deeper into the psychological mechanics behind moral breakdown. People prefer to see themselves as good, but goodness often depends on comfort. It is easy to be generous when abundance surrounds you. It is easy to be kind when you feel safe. It is easy to be tolerant when your identity is affirmed. But the moment these conditions shift, morality becomes malleable. People begin bending rules in their favor. They justify small betrayals as necessity. They rationalize self-interest as survival. And once that shift begins, it spreads quickly through communities. Moral collapse rarely starts with violence or cruelty. It starts with fear, silence, withdrawal, and self-preservation. Once enough individuals bend, the entire group follows. Machiavelli recognized this collective fragility, which is why he believed leaders must understand human psychology, not human ideals. Ideals dissolve. Psychology doesn't. This leads into the next idea. Morality breaks fastest during social hysteria. When communities face collective pressure, economic downturns, political division, cultural conflict, people regress into primal instincts. They seek simple narratives, clear enemies, quick solutions. They abandon nuance. They look for leaders who speak in absolutes because uncertainty feels unbearable. And in that emotional state, morality becomes negotiable. Fear dictates ethics. Anger shapes justice. Outrage replaces empathy. This is where modern Stoicism enters as a counterforce. While Machiavelli reveals the instability of human behavior, Stoicism provides a method to stay grounded amid that instability. Where emotional hysteria pushes people into reactive behavior, Stoicism anchors you in rational clarity. While others collapse into fear-driven choices, Stoicism trains you to pause, reflect, and act deliberately. It separates what you control from what you don't, protecting you from the emotional storms that make others unpredictable. Stoicism does not deny the dark side of human nature. It prepares you for it. It teaches that people will falter, panic, betray, and overreact. It teaches that your own impulses can betray you if you don't govern them. It teaches that morality must be chosen repeatedly, not assumed. And most importantly, it teaches that your inner world can remain stable even when society becomes psychologically unrecognizable. In a world where morality fractures easily, Stoicism becomes a form of internal armor. It doesn't promise that others will act rationally. It ensures that you can. It doesn't guarantee protection from chaos. It guarantees you won't become chaotic yourself. And in a society where group psychology can spiral into darkness quickly, the individual who maintains inner discipline becomes a rare force of clarity. Machiavelli's map of the human mind. Fear, desire, ego, and perception. Every philosopher tries to understand how humans should behave. Machiavelli was one of the few who focused on how humans actually behave. He stripped away the idealistic stories people tell about themselves and studied the emotional machinery beneath the surface. Fear, desire, ego, insecurity, and the illusions people create to protect themselves. What he discovered wasn't flattering, but it was precise. And that precision is what made his psychology timeless. This section begins with Machiavelli's most unsettling insight. People act more out of fear than reason. They fear embarrassment, fear rejection, fear losing status, fear losing comfort, fear losing control. Fear shapes decisions far more than conscious logic. When someone avoids confrontation, it's fear. When someone erupts in anger, it's fear disguised as aggression. When someone betrays an ally, it's fear of missing opportunity or fear of personal risk. Machiavelli saw fear as the engine behind political decisions, military failures, family conflicts, and social behavior. And today, fear is still the invisible architect of modern life. The second force Machiavelli highlighted was desire, the endless striving for more comfort, more validation, more recognition, more power. People rarely admit this, but desire is a constant whisper in their minds. It pushes them to change beliefs, shift alliances, or compromise principles. In relationships, desire makes people chase what harms them. In politics, it drives corruption. Online, it fuels performative behavior. Desire is rarely logical. It doesn't negotiate, it takes. And when it is blocked, people become unpredictable. Then comes the third force, ego, the most fragile component of all. Machiavelli observed that ego makes people behave irrationally in order to protect a self-image that only exists in their minds. Ego turns small disagreements into emotional warfare. It turns simple corrections into personal insults. It makes people cling to opinions even when evidence proves them wrong. Ego forces people to defend illusions rather than confront truth. This fragile identity is why humans fall into conflict so easily, why apologies feel threatening, and why vulnerability feels like loss of power. But the most dangerous part of the human mind, according to Machiavelli, is not fear, desire, or ego. It is perception. People follow what they perceive to be strong, not what is actually strong. They trust what they perceive to be certain, not what is accurate. They respect the appearance of confidence more than actual wisdom. This explains why charismatic leaders rise even when they lack competence. Why influencers gain authority without substance. Why people imitate trends they don't understand. Humans are creatures of perception first, logic second. And because perception is emotional, it can be shaped. This section then explores how these psychological forces appear in modern society. Fear can be seen in social media outrage, where people attack strangers for fear of being attacked themselves. Desire appears in endless comparison, people reshaping their lives to fit online aesthetics or public validation. Ego appears in arguments where no one listens, only defends. Perception appears in curated personas, where appearance replaces reality. Nothing about modern life contradicts Machiavelli's observations. It reinforces them. But this isn't a condemnation of humanity. It's a map. And once you understand the map, you stop getting lost in people's behavior. You begin to see patterns. You begin to predict emotional reactions before they arrive. You read motives more clearly. You interpret silence, tone shifts, inconsistencies, and emotional outbursts with precision. The next part of this section explains how people rationalize their behavior. Humans rarely admit fear, they label it morality. They rarely admit desire, they call it destiny. They rarely admit ego, they call it principles. They rarely admit perception, they call it truth. This psychological camouflage makes people believe they are rational, even when they are driven by forces they don't recognize. Machiavelli believed understanding this gap, the gap between what people claim and what actually drives them, is the essence of power. Not domination power, but psychological clarity. The power to avoid manipulation. The power to see people without the filters of romanticism or cynicism. The power to operate in reality rather than illusion. This section then shifts to how this understanding can protect you. When you know fear drives people, you stop taking their aggression personally. When you know desire drives people, you stop expecting loyalty without incentive. When you know ego drives people, you handle conflicts with calm clarity rather than emotional retaliation. When you know perception governs people, you focus on your presence, boundaries, and consistency rather than persuasion. This is where modern Stoicism begins to merge with Machiavellian realism. Stoicism teaches you to control your internal reactions. Machiavelli teaches you to understand external behavior. Together, they create psychological balance, clarity on the outside and discipline on the inside. The Machiavellian Stoic hybrid. How to outsmart emotional chaos without becoming cold. There is a delicate balance between seeing the world clearly and becoming hardened by it. People who understand human behavior often fall into cynicism. People who try to stay moral often fall into naivety. The real challenge, the rare achievement, is to be perceptive without becoming paranoid, disciplined without becoming detached, and strategic without losing compassion. This section explores the hybrid mindset that makes this balance possible. The union of Machiavellian realism with Stoic emotional discipline. The core idea begins with this truth. Machiavelli teaches you how others behave. Stoicism teaches you how not to lose yourself in the process. When these two philosophies are separated, they become incomplete. Machiavellian thinking alone can make you manipulative or distrustful. Stoicism alone can make you passive or dismissive of power dynamics. But when combined, they produce emotional authority, clarity on the outside, calmness on the inside. This section opens by explaining what it means to read motives with precision. Machiavelli believed every action has a psychological root. People who seem hostile are often insecure. People who flatter excessively often want something. People who argue aggressively are usually protecting an identity, not a truth. People who withdraw emotionally are guarding a wound, not demonstrating strength. When you interpret behavior through this lens, you stop taking things personally. You stop reacting impulsively. You start seeing people as they are, not as threats, but as predictable patterns of fear, desire, ego, and insecurity. But understanding motives is only half the hybrid. The other half is Stoic emotional neutrality. Neutrality means you can observe behavior without absorbing it. You can see manipulation without being triggered by it. You can witness conflict without becoming part of it. You can feel an emotional impulse without obeying it. Neutrality is not numbness, it is spaciousness. It gives you room to think. It gives you room to choose your response rather than become controlled by instinct. Stoic neutrality becomes especially powerful when combined with Machiavellian awareness in high-pressure situations. Imagine someone attacking your character. A reactive mind defends itself emotionally. A Machiavellian mind analyzes the motive. A Stoic Machiavellian mind does both. It sees the psychological insecurity behind the attack and chooses a calm, deliberate response that protects dignity without escalating conflict. This is not suppression, it is strategy through clarity. The section then moves into everyday examples of how this hybrid mindset works. Consider a workplace conflict. Someone tries to undermine you. A purely emotional person panics or retaliates. A purely Machiavellian person plots revenge. A purely Stoic person ignores it but risks appearing passive. The hybrid mind does something different. It sees the person's motive, fear of losing relevance, desire for recognition, remains emotionally neutral, and responds strategically, setting boundaries without aggression. The result is influence without hostility. Consider a romantic relationship. One partner becomes distant or irritable. A reactive mind spirals into anxiety. A Machiavellian mind assumes deceit. A Stoic mind avoids reacting but may become cold. The hybrid mind recognizes the underlying fear or insecurity, remains calm, and addresses the issue with clarity rather than panic. This creates emotional trust rather than emotional chaos. Consider social pressure. People try to provoke you, insult you, pull you into arguments, or push you into conformity. A reactive mind collapses. A Machiavellian mind becomes defensive or manipulative. A Stoic mind withdraws entirely. But the hybrid mind remains composed, evaluates motives, chooses its battles, and protects its identity without losing empathy or control. The next part of the section explores strategic empathy, a concept that merges Stoic stability with Machiavellian perception. Strategic empathy is the ability to understand someone's emotional state without validating unhealthy behavior. It allows you to decode insecurity without enabling it. It helps you support people without sacrificing your boundaries. You understand emotions intellectually without becoming owned by them. Strategic empathy turns emotional chaos into information rather than stress. This hybrid mindset also transforms how you interpret conflict. Most people fear confrontation because they think conflict is a sign of failure. Machiavellian realism sees conflict as inevitable. Stoicism sees conflict as neutral. The hybrid sees conflict as data, a window into someone's true values, insecurities, and intentions. Instead of reacting emotionally, you use the conflict to understand the deeper psychological root, which helps you respond with clarity. Then comes the power dynamic. Machiavelli emphasized that power is perception. Stoicism emphasized that power is self-control. The hybrid realizes that true power is both. When your inner world is calm, people feel it. When you understand human behavior, people sense it. When you don't react emotionally, people adjust their tone around you. You command respect without demanding it. You influence others without forcing them. Your presence becomes a form of silent authority. This section then explains how to resist manipulation without becoming manipulative. Many people who learn Machiavellian ideas become defensive or suspicious. But Stoicism prevents this by grounding you in integrity. You understand manipulation, but you do not use it. You see emotional games clearly, but you refuse to play them. You detect deception early, but you respond with dignity instead of aggression. This is psychological strength without cruelty. The hybrid mind also prevents emotional burnout. Understanding human nature can be draining if done through fear or cynicism. Stoicism prevents this by teaching emotional detachment. It reminds you that you cannot control other people, only your responses. This reduces the emotional burden of dealing with unpredictable behavior. You become a witness to human psychology, not a victim of it. As this section deepens, it explores the nature of inner power. Inner power is the ability to walk through emotionally chaotic environments and remain yourself. It is the ability to speak clearly when others shout. It is the ability to stay patient when others panic. It is the ability to maintain identity when others lose theirs. Machiavellian realism gives you awareness. Stoic discipline gives you steadiness. Together, they give you sovereignty. The section closes with a powerful idea. Clarity is not coldness. Emotional neutrality is not detachment from humanity. Understanding human behavior deeply does not make you cynical. It makes you compassionate. When you see insecurity behind aggression, you respond with calm. When you see fear behind anger, you respond with stability. When you see confusion behind conflict, you respond with clarity. You are no longer intimidated by emotional storms because you understand their origins and control your responses. The Machiavellian Stoic hybrid. How to outsmart emotional chaos without becoming cold. There is a delicate balance between seeing the world clearly and becoming hardened by it. People who understand human behavior often fall into cynicism. People who try to stay moral often fall into naivety. The rare achievement is found in the middle. Being perceptive without becoming paranoid, disciplined without becoming numb, strategic without abandoning compassion. This is the essence of the Machiavellian Stoic hybrid, a mindset that gives you clarity toward others and control over yourself. Machiavelli teaches how human nature behaves under pressure, how fear shapes choices, how desire distorts logic, how ego controls reactions, and how perception drives loyalty. Stoicism teaches how to stay stable inside that reality, how to regulate emotions, how to pause before responding, how to detach from impulses, and how to act from principle instead of panic. When the two merge, something rare appears: emotional authority. Reading motives becomes instinctive. Hostility is recognized as insecurity. Excessive praise is understood as an attempt to gain advantage. Withdrawal is seen as protection rather than disrespect. Patterns reveal themselves long before words are spoken. You no longer become confused by people, you begin to anticipate them. Neutrality then becomes your anchor. You don't imitate aggression. You don't collapse into anxiety. You don't internalize other people's chaos. Instead, you create a quiet space between what happens and how you respond. In that space, clarity grows. You stay steady while others rush. You stay rational while others react. You stay intentional while others fall into their own impulses. This mindset changes how you navigate conflict. You no longer see conflict as a threat, but as information. People reveal their character under pressure. Their tone, their hesitation, their emotional spikes, all become clues. You can respond calmly because you're not interpreting the moment as a personal attack but as part of a predictable psychological sequence. You see the insecurity beneath the anger, the fear beneath the silence, the longing beneath the manipulation. And with that understanding, you choose responses that preserve your dignity and protect your boundaries. Strategic empathy grows from this clarity. You understand emotions without absorbing them. You witness pain without becoming entangled in it. You can care for people without letting their turmoil dictate your behavior. You can communicate with disarmed presence, not defensive energy. This makes you more compassionate, not less, because compassion becomes a choice, not a reflex. Power in this hybrid form is quiet. It's found not in dominance but in steadiness. Not in manipulation but in awareness. Not in intimidation but in emotional structure. Others begin adjusting their tone around you. They think before they speak. They hesitate before lying. They soften during conflict. Your presence influences without effort because it introduces stability where others feel instability. This psychological independence doesn't isolate you. It frees you. You no longer react to every emotional wave around you. You no longer chase validation. You no longer fall into the traps of guilt, pressure, or provocation. Instead, you become someone who can walk into emotionally charged spaces and remain fully yourself, unaffected by the storms that pull others apart. Dark psychology in relationships. Attraction, manipulation, and boundary power. If you want to understand the darkest truths of human behavior, you don't need to study war or politics. You only need to study relationships. Romantic, familial, social. These are the arenas where our insecurities are most exposed, our instincts most activated, and our masks most fragile. In relationships, people reveal what they fear, what they crave, and what they will sacrifice to feel valued or in control. Beneath the surface of affection, loyalty, and companionship, an intricate psychological battlefield is always operating. This section begins with an uncomfortable insight. People rarely behave rationally in relationships. They behave emotionally. Attraction is often fueled less by compatibility and more by insecurity, curiosity, and the fear of being alone. Withdrawal is often a defense mechanism rather than a sign of disinterest. Jealousy is usually disguised vulnerability. Anger is often unspoken fear. And manipulation, more frequently than not, isn't malicious, it's unconscious. People use the tools they learned in childhood. Guilt to feel seen, silence to feel powerful, overgiving to feel safe, or emotional chaos to feel significant. Understanding this doesn't make relationships colder. It makes them clearer. When you see the emotional roots beneath someone's actions, the confusion stops. You stop personalizing what isn't actually about you. You stop absorbing emotions that have nothing to do with your character. And you begin to navigate interactions with more stability than most people know how to maintain. This leads into one of the most important ideas. Emotional independence is the real foundation of attraction. People instinctively gravitate toward partners who do not collapse under stress, who do not cling out of fear, and who do not need constant reassurance to feel secure. Emotional stability is rare in the modern world, which makes it magnetic. It signals maturity, self-respect, and clarity. A person who can be alone is more attractive than someone who cannot. A person who remains calm during conflict feels safer than someone who spirals. A person who speaks clearly rather than emotionally pressuring others feels trustworthy. Stoicism enters here not as philosophy, but as emotional architecture. You have power over your mind, not outside events. When you apply this to relationships, you don't react out of fear. You don't attack out of insecurity. You don't withdraw out of punishment. You respond with intention. You speak with clarity. You set boundaries without anger. You apologize without losing dignity. You express love without losing autonomy. This discipline becomes charisma, quiet, grounded, powerful. Not the charismatic charm that fades, but the kind that reshapes the emotional energy of any connection you enter. Then comes the darker side, manipulation. Most manipulation is subtle and unconscious, not dramatic or villainous. People use guilt to avoid abandonment. They use silence to create pressure. They use anger to regain control. They use flattery to secure approval. They use vulnerability to escape accountability. These tactics are often rooted in fear, not malice. But they distort the natural balance of a relationship. Understanding Machiavelli helps you recognize these patterns early. Understanding Stoicism helps you resist them without becoming defensive. When someone tries to guilt-trip you, instead of reacting emotionally, you ask yourself, what fear is driving this? What insecurity are they trying to avoid? Suddenly, you are no longer a target. You are an observer, and observers cannot be controlled. This awareness naturally leads to boundary power. Boundaries are not punishments. They are instructions for how others may treat you. When delivered calmly, boundaries signal self-respect. They communicate that your emotional world is not open to invasion. They require no threats, no anger, no emotional theatrics. Just clarity. And clarity is harder to challenge than aggression. A boundary can be as simple as, "I don't engage with yelling," or, "I will continue this conversation when you're ready to speak respectfully." Most people have never experienced calm boundaries, so they adjust themselves around them without realizing why. You influence behavior not by force, but by stability. This clarity doesn't make you untouchable. It makes you dependable. People relax around someone who doesn't overreact. They feel grounded around someone who doesn't panic. They feel respected around someone who doesn't try to control them. This is how emotional independence becomes social gravity. The section then turns toward the deeper truth. Relationships often reveal a person's internal world more than anything else. A partner who avoids conflict is often afraid of abandonment. A partner who constantly tests your loyalty is often afraid of betrayal. A partner who criticizes everything may be trying to hide their own inadequacy. People are rarely cruel without reason, needy without history, or distant without wounds. Seeing this clearly doesn't excuse the behavior, but it allows you to respond with intelligence rather than impulse. Stoic detachment becomes essential here. Detachment does not mean distancing yourself emotionally. It means refusing to let another person's instability dictate your own. It means you can love deeply without losing yourself. You can argue without aggression. You can walk away from toxicity without guilt. You can support someone without absorbing their chaos. Detachment keeps your identity steady while allowing compassion to remain intact. As the section moves forward, it reveals a final insight. The darkest parts of human behavior emerge when people feel unsafe, not physically, but emotionally. When identity feels threatened, they lash out. When fear rises, they manipulate. When insecurity overwhelms them, they cling or withdraw. When ego collapses, they blame. Understanding this gives you the ability to stand steady in moments where others break down. This is not cynicism. It is preparation. It is the ability to care without being consumed, to connect without losing clarity, and to remain compassionate without becoming blind. It is the emotional version of armor, not to fight, but to remain whole in a world where many are breaking without realizing why. What emerges from this understanding is not distance, it's mastery. A way of moving through relationships that avoids chaos, prevents manipulation, and cultivates deep, respectful connection. A way of seeing people's shadows without fearing them, and seeing your own without shame. And with this foundation, the story naturally expands into the broader world, where these same psychological forces scale from personal relationships to entire societies. Society's hidden machinery, mass behavior, outrage, influence, and algorithmic control. The forces that shape individual relationships are the same forces that shape entire societies. Magnified, weaponized, and multiplied by millions of minds operating under fear, desire, ego, and perception. What happens inside a single insecure person becomes exponentially more volatile when echoed across a population. A society is not a rational organism. It is a living network of emotional impulses, psychological contagions, and shifting collective identities. And when you look closely, you begin to see something unsettling. The world is not driven by truth, but by emotional momentum. The first layer of this hidden machinery is crowd psychology. Individuals can be calm, thoughtful, and nuanced. But groups are reactive, impatient, and easily provoked. When people join a crowd, physically or digitally, they adopt its emotional temperature. Anger spreads faster than curiosity. Outrage spreads faster than understanding. Fear spreads faster than facts. The crowd becomes a nervous system reacting in unison, and the individuals inside it lose much of their independent judgment. History is filled with examples of entire populations turning against neighbors, alliances collapsing overnight, and collective panic making rational decisions impossible. The digital world has amplified this psychological vulnerability. Human beings evolved in small tribes of a few dozen people, not global networks of billions. The brain cannot distinguish between a threat in front of it and a digital outrage circulating on a screen. As a result, people are constantly reacting to stimuli that were never meant to reach them. Every headline is a threat. Every opinion is a judgment. Every disagreement becomes a personal danger. The nervous system is overwhelmed by a fire hose of emotional triggers. This creates fertile ground for manipulation at scale. Political groups, corporations, influencers, and even algorithms understand something most people don't. Emotional responses are predictable. If you want attention, trigger outrage. If you want loyalty, trigger fear. If you want obedience, trigger uncertainty. If you want distraction, trigger desire. The tools Machiavelli once described in terms of rulers and citizens are now applied through screens, notifications, curated feeds, and manufactured narratives that shape how millions of people feel without them realizing why. This section then examines the machinery that powers these reactions, algorithms designed to monetize the darkest corners of human psychology. These systems measure what you hesitate to look at, what triggers you, what validates you, what enrages you. They feed you content engineered to amplify those reactions. Not because they understand philosophy, but because they understand attention. Attention is drawn to emotional spikes, not calm clarity. So the digital architecture of modern society is built around emotional manipulation, not rational discourse. People think they are forming independent opinions, but many are simply adopting the emotional state the algorithm has trained them into. Winters of fear, summers of rage, cycles of panic, waves of tribal conflict. Identity-driven thinking replaces nuanced reflection. Outrage becomes a personality. Belonging becomes more valuable than truth. And once again, Machiavelli's observations resurface. People follow perceptions, not facts. Confidence, not competence. Simplicity, not complexity. This is where modern Stoicism becomes crucial. Stoicism is not just an ancient philosophy, it is the antidote to psychological contagion. It teaches you to slow down when society speeds up, to reflect when others react, to separate your mind from the emotional storms around you. When Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You become what you give your attention to," he was unknowingly describing the greatest psychological vulnerability of the digital age. Attention has become the battlefield. And whoever controls your attention controls your emotions, your worldview, your beliefs, and ultimately your behavior. This section then explores how to reclaim that attention. It begins with emotional filtering, learning to recognize when your nervous system is being manipulated. When a headline is designed to provoke. When an argument is designed to divide. When a trend is designed to seduce. When a narrative is designed to distract. The hybrid mindset from earlier sections becomes essential here. Machiavellian realism helps you see the strategic intent behind the influence, while Stoicism stabilizes your emotional response to it. Once you learn to see through these forces, the world changes shape. You realize that most people are not thinking, they are reacting. Not deciding, they are following emotional cues. Not expressing beliefs, they are echoing the sentiments of their digital environment. This understanding doesn't generate superiority. It generates clarity. You no longer get caught in the emotional whirlpools that pull society into cycles of chaos. You step outside of them the way a Stoic steps outside of internal impulses, observing without absorbing. Influence now reveals itself as an invisible architecture shaping behavior. Outrage becomes predictable. Trends become formulas. Ideologies become emotional movements, not intellectual structures. And through this clarity, you can move through modern society without being consumed by it. You can disagree without hostility. You can follow information without being led by emotion. You can form opinions without becoming attached to digital tribes. The story then draws a wider lens. Societies collapse not because people lose intelligence, but because they lose emotional stability. When enough individuals surrender their attention to external forces, the collective psychological structure collapses. Fear becomes policy, anger becomes culture, division becomes identity, and the world moves not by logic, but by waves of emotional instinct. This is why understanding the hidden mechanics of mass behavior isn't just an intellectual exercise. It is survival. The person who learns to remain calm in a society addicted to emotional reactivity becomes a stabilizing force. The person who sees manipulation clearly becomes resistant to it. The person who reclaims their attention reclaims their sovereignty. And as this section unfolds, it becomes clear that the individual who masters both Stoic discipline and Machiavellian awareness operates above the noise, not separated from society, but no longer controlled by it. The mind becomes a place of order in a world of disorder, a place of clarity in a world of distortion. From here, the story naturally shifts inward, toward the deeper question of what it means to remain sovereign in a world built to influence, provoke, and manipulate the human mind. Inner sovereignty, becoming untouchable in a manipulative world. There comes a point in every person's life when they must decide whether they want to be shaped by the world or whether they want to shape themselves. Modern society is full of forces designed to influence, provoke, persuade, and destabilize the mind. Every platform, every narrative, every emotional wave tries to pull you into its rhythm. Most people give in without realizing they've surrendered. But a few choose the harder path, the path of inner sovereignty. Inner sovereignty begins with a simple recognition: your mind is the last territory you truly control. Everything else, your reputation, your relationships, your environment, your future, can change without permission. But your inner world is yours to structure or abandon. Marcus Aurelius wrote more than 2,000 years ago that the mind can remain calm even when the world shatters around it. He wasn't speaking to emperors. He was speaking to anyone willing to cultivate the discipline to govern themselves. This section explores the architecture of that inner government. The first pillar is emotional independence. Emotional independence doesn't mean avoiding connection or rejecting support. It means refusing to let your sense of worth depend on external approval. It means you don't need constant reassurance to feel secure. You don't collapse when someone pulls away. You don't panic when life becomes unpredictable. You stay rooted in principles instead of soaking in the emotional weather of the moment. The second pillar is identity clarity. Identity is not a mask. It is a foundation. Masks crumble under pressure, but foundations hold. People who lack identity clarity reshape themselves constantly, agreeing with whoever is in front of them, fearing rejection, abandoning boundaries, fearing being disliked. The sovereign mind defines itself internally. It does not outsource its values to trends, crowds, or emotional pressures. It knows what it will tolerate and what it will walk away from. It knows what matters and what doesn't. This clarity makes a person unshakable. The third pillar is cognitive discipline, the ability to separate instinct from judgment. Modern society runs on impulsive reactions. But sovereignty begins with a pause, a breath, a moment of awareness before action. In this space, manipulation loses its power. Emotional triggers lose their control. Overthinking loses its grip. When you pause, you reclaim authorship over your behavior. You act instead of react. You decide instead of being dragged. The next pillar is detachment from outcomes. Detachment is often misunderstood as apathy, but it is the opposite. It is the ability to give your best without becoming enslaved to the result. When your happiness depends entirely on outcomes, you become vulnerable to everything outside your control. Fear creeps in. Desperation grows. Manipulation works more easily. But when your identity is not chained to a specific result, you become harder to influence. You negotiate better. You speak more clearly. You leave unhealthy situations without emotional collapse. You become free. Another element of sovereignty is emotional patience. People often crumble not because of a problem, but because they expect every discomfort to end quickly. Stoicism teaches patience as a form of strength, the endurance of temporary pain without panic, the ability to sit with uncertainty without self-destruction. Emotional patience makes you resilient in arguments, grounded in crises, and stable in relationships. It gives you a long horizon in a world addicted to immediacy. Then comes the most subtle pillar, managing your internal narrative. Humans do not respond to events, they respond to the story they tell about events. Change the story, and you change the emotional impact. When something goes wrong, people without sovereignty create narratives of failure, rejection, doom, or panic. The sovereign mind reframes with intention. It interprets setbacks as information, not identity. It sees insults as reflections of the speaker, not of its own worth. It views uncertainty as possibility rather than danger. The inner narrative becomes an engine of stability instead of a source of chaos. The final pillar is quiet strength. Strength without display, confidence without noise, calm without suppression. Quiet strength is what people trust. It's what they follow. It's what they respect. Those who possess it do not need to prove themselves. Their presence speaks before they do. Their decisions carry weight without force. Their silence carries authority. This is the type of power that neither manipulation nor chaos can penetrate, because it comes from a mind that has learned to govern itself completely. This section then explores how sovereignty reshapes your interactions with others. When you are no longer reactive, people stop trying to provoke you. When you are no longer desperate for validation, people stop withholding it to control you. When you no longer fear walking away, people stop playing emotional games. When your sense of worth is internal, external negativity loses its leverage. Sovereignty disarms manipulation without confrontation. It dissolves chaos without absorbing it. It transforms relationships not through dominance, but through stability. The world becomes less threatening when you no longer depend on it for inner certainty. Social pressure loses its bite. Criticism loses its sting. Rejection loses its ability to break you. Approval loses its addictive pull. You start choosing connections based on compatibility, not fear. You start creating boundaries based on values, not anxiety. You start trusting yourself more deeply than you trust anyone else. Here, the story gathers its psychological threads. Fear, desire, ego, perception, emotional chaos, manipulation, societal pressure. All these forces remain part of the human experience. Nothing can eliminate them, but sovereignty makes you immune to their control. Machiavellian realism shows you how these forces operate. Stoicism shows you how to remain untouched by them. Together, they form a shield that does not close you off from the world, but opens it to you with greater clarity than most people ever experience. From this point forward, the narrative naturally moves toward its closing message, the idea that understanding the dark side of human behavior is not about becoming hardened, but about becoming wise enough to navigate the world with a calm, steady, unshakable mind. The unseen victory of the calm mind in every era of history. Humanity has wrestled with the same inner forces: fear that clouds judgment, desire that distorts truth, ego that blinds perception, and chaos that spreads through societies like a silent fire. Civilizations rise and fall by these forces. Relationships grow and break through them. And individual lives are shaped, sometimes destroyed, by impulses so ancient we barely recognize them before they take control. But understanding these forces does not turn you into a spectator of collapse. It turns you into the exception. The one who sees clearly what others distort. The one who stays steady while others spin in emotional circles. The one who navigates a manipulative world without becoming manipulative yourself. All the insights you've traveled through: Machiavelli's realism, Stoicism's discipline, the psychology of fear and desire, the mechanics of influence and perception, the emotional battles inside relationships, the societal storms created by outrage and identity, come together here in a single shift of perspective. The calm mind wins not because it dominates, but because it cannot be dominated. You become untouchable not by shutting yourself off, but by knowing yourself so well that no one else can decide your emotions for you. You stop being pulled by fear because you understand its patterns. You stop being controlled by desire because you recognize how easily it can be weaponized. You stop being manipulated by ego games because you refuse to play them. And you stop being lost in societal chaos because you no longer outsource your identity to crowds. This is the quiet power that Machiavelli hinted at, a power grounded not in force but in awareness. A power that sees the dark side of human behavior without being corrupted by it. A power that allows you to move through the world with strategic clarity and emotional integrity. It is also the heart of Stoicism, the conviction that the mind, once disciplined, becomes a fortress, that your attention is your sovereignty, that your responses define your character more than anything that happens to you, that when you stand still internally, the world loses its ability to shake you. Inner sovereignty is not loud. It does not need applause. It does not depend on recognition. It manifests in the way you carry yourself, in the way you speak, in the way you choose your battles, in the way you hold silence when others panic, in the way you remain present when others disappear into their emotions. This final truth remains. When you master your mind, the world cannot master you. When you understand human nature, you stop fearing it. When you see clearly, you cannot be deceived easily. And when you remain calm in a world addicted to reactivity, you become the rarest kind of presence, the kind people trust, follow, and remember. The dark side of human behavior will always exist. But once you see it clearly, once you recognize the patterns and reclaim your sovereignty, it no longer feels like a threat. It becomes part of the landscape you navigate with composure, understanding, and a sense of quiet mastery. And in that state, something profound happens. You stop reacting to the world. You start shaping it.